Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kim Folds. I'm a research manager at University Research Co. with the Reading Within Reach project. And today we have a very exciting webinar from the team from JPAL. As you should be able to see on your screen, today's webinar is Moving Beyond Inputs, Evidence from Models to Improve Learning in Developing Countries. To give a little background, JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, we are going to hear from their education team today. They're going to give more background on what JPAL does, so I won't spend too much time on that. But just to give a little context, the education sector seeks to improve access to and delivery of high-quality schooling at the primary and post-primary levels through research on issues like pedagogy, teacher training, incentives, school governance, early childhood development, and information and communications technology. Our three esteemed participants today, John Floretta is Associate Director of Policy. He just gave a little wave. Associate Director of Policy for JPAL. He works with policymakers, JPAL-affiliated researchers, and JPAL global and regional staff to disseminate lessons from randomized evaluations and to promote evidence-informed decision-making and scale-ups of successful social programs. Meagan Neal is a policy associate at JPAL Global, where she writes policy publications, helps forge new research partnerships, and shares lessons from JPAL evaluations with policymakers. And last but not least, Luke Strathmann is a senior policy associate at JPAL, where he helps forge new research partnerships, writes policy publications, and conducts outreach with policymakers to disseminate evidence from JPAL evaluations. He works on JPAL's education sector, manages the Post-Primary Education Initiative, and works closely with JPAL's Latin American and Caribbean office. So they will share their slides, present their lessons, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. You're welcome to share any questions that you might have. I'll be facilitating the Q&A, and they'll be also monitoring questions from where they're sitting. You can send questions through the Q&A, questions and answers window, as well as through the chat window if you want to send them directly to me, to any of our presenters, to Meagan Neal, or to any of the panelists. So without further ado, I will mute myself and hand it over to the JPAL team.
Great. Thank you much, Kimberly. And it's a very big honor for us to be here to do what we love to do, which is share evidence in the education sector. And the Global Reading Network seems to be a great opportunity to do this. So as Kimberly said, Luke, Meagan, and myself are all staff members at JPAL based at MIT, working in education. Overall, we have about 50 professors who are affiliated with JPAL that have education as part of their research agenda. And the overall education team at JPAL is led by our executive director, Rachel Glenister, and a professor at the University of California, San Diego, named Kartik Muralidharan. Let me start off by first focusing on just a general outline for today. I will briefly and quickly as possible give a quick overview of the JPAL education program, and then the heart of this presentation will be what Meagan and Luke will be presenting. So Meagan will be focusing on the evidence that we have around school inputs, so things like books, textbooks, IT. And Luke will be focusing on the switch to pedagogy, and so the types of evidence there are around interventions that are focused on improving pedagogy. JPAL, just in brief, the core of what we do are evaluations, and specifically randomized control trials. What we're very interested in is not that these randomized control trials end up being excellent academic papers, but in particular, the link between the evaluations themselves and policy. So improving education programs, particularly for the poor, by trying to channel resources towards evidence-informed interventions. In capacity building, we end up focusing on helping to develop the capacity of researchers and policymakers to use and understand evidence. As I mentioned, JPAL is a network of professors. Right now we have over 142 professors from over 40 universities, largely based in the United States, but we also have professors who are based in Europe and Latin America, in South Asia. The majority of them are economists. We know very well that economists don't have the answer to most or many development challenges, but the role of economists here is to work with implementers and policymakers and practitioners to design promising development solutions, and then our role is largely to play, the primary function is to be able to test them rigorously with evaluations. JPAL has been around for 13 years. Overall, through our affiliates, we've conducted over 770 ongoing or completed evaluations in nearly 70 countries. You'll see we work, in addition to education, 7 other sectors. In the JPAL North America and JPAL Global offices are based at MIT. In other regions, we work with local universities and implement our programs and our policy outreach through them. And one of the areas where we have the largest education base, particularly within primary education, is the education sector. So we've completed over 186 education studies in 39 countries. And I won't get into the specifics of what a randomized control trial is, but I think it's an important place to start considering that's what we focus on. So randomized evaluation is one tool, one monitoring and evaluation tool, which allows us to precisely measure the impact of the program. And today we'll be speaking specifically about reading programs. It allows us to attribute any change to the program itself as opposed to some external factor. I'll try to explain what it is just with 2 simple ideas. First, it's a prospective evaluation where essentially we first pick a large enough sample size, and second, randomly assign the program to randomly select certain units in that sample to assign the program to. So an example would be if we're trying to test a supplementary remedial education program with an NGO, look at a sample size, a big enough sample size, let me say that's 200. And then before the program begins, we randomly choose through a lottery, say 100 of those schools to receive and implement the program. At the end of the program, we would look at the average learning between the schools who received the program and the schools who did not, and be able to attribute the differences in learning, hopefully increases in learning, to the program itself as opposed to some external factor. So that's just a brief primer on randomized evaluations, because all the evidence that Luke and Meagan will be sharing, the vast majority of that will be from randomized control trials. My last slide is why do we conduct rigorous evaluations or randomized evaluations? And I'll slightly rephrase some of these bullet points. I think first is that, again, we're not recommending RCTs of all education programs. We see randomized evaluations as one tool in the broader monitoring, evaluation, and learning toolbox. We do think it's useful to do rigorous evaluation in several circumstances. The first is like looking at testing theories or common interventions that don't have a strong evidence base or don't have a strong evidence base in developing countries. So do smaller classes really benefit students and to improve reading? Does increasing teacher pay lead to better reading outcomes? Sometimes we find things that there's strong theory for don't actually work in practice in developing countries. Sometimes it's the other way around, where things that we think are primarily like a health intervention, such as school-based deworming to kill intestinal worms given through schools, actually has really large education benefits. In Western Kenya, a deworming program increased attendance by 25%. Second, and perhaps most important here, is to understand what are the binding constraints that keeps young children from being able to learn to read. And again, sometimes what we think are the binding constraints are not the first order challenges. So here is, I think one thing that's common is to look at binding constraints in the developed world and apply them to the developing world, and that it doesn't always map so easily one-to-one. So I think what Meagan will be focusing on is programs which have provided inputs to increase learning, and by and large we found out that inputs alone, while may be necessary, are not sufficient. The third bullet point is establishing a proof of concept is trying to understand that if a particular promising innovation is implemented well at small scale with good training and extra monitoring, is that idea, does it work like a kind of a model gold-plated program? So one example could be performance-based pay for teachers. The other thing that we would do then is after that is study it actually in the real world, so more of an effectiveness trial to see at large scale. So the idea works, but could it be implemented at large scale? And what we bring to the education space, again, we're not necessarily education experts, is thinking as well on the, in addition to using economics to rigorously evaluate the impact of programs, also using some economics to set up and to design together with education specialists different programs. So it could be, performance-based pay models for teachers, testing out if they work. It could also be like thinking about how does information change behavior. So if we are sharing information with people in developing countries about the quality of local schools, does that shape the parents' investment decision of which schools to spend their money on or which schools to leverage? So let me stop there. I would encourage you, if you have any questions about these slides, to submit them now so Kimberly and we don't get hit with a deluge of questions at the very end. I will pass over to my colleague Meagan, who will be focusing on, again, inputs and then kind of this link between inputs and pedagogy before passing over to Luke to focus on evidence around promising pedagogy interventions.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So now that you all have a bit of background on JPAL and what we do, we're going to get into the meat of the presentation and start talking about what we want to focus on, which is the evidence. And to frame that a bit, we're going to start with some global trends in education. Now, as you all know, in the past, a lot of the global education focus has been on improving access to schooling via enrollment. And that's been really successful. We've seen huge increases in primary school enrollment around the world. But as you all also know, those increases in enrollment haven't necessarily translated to increases in learning. For example, in rural India in 2014, only 52% of fifth graders could read a second grade text. And we see similar results from places like Pakistan and East Africa. And with Sustainable Development Goals, we're increasingly seeing a global shift in focus from access to quality of learning. So like John mentioned, most of JPAL's education work is trying to get at those two main questions. How can we increase participation, which we see as not just enrollment, but also attendance and how much time kids are spending in school? And how can we increase learning? So today, we're going to focus on reading outcomes and discuss a bunch of randomized evaluations that have looked at different ways to increase learning. Most of these studies use reading levels as their main outcome measure, but I want to flag that we also bring in a couple that look at math. Because when we look at what is actually preventing learning in these cases, we think that the lessons from these studies are most likely applicable to reading interventions as well. So before we get started talking about individual interventions, it's really important to think about why children might not be learning to read even though they are in school. Like John mentioned, what's the binding constraint that is preventing them from becoming strong readers? So here on this slide are a number of hypotheses as to why children might not be learning. Maybe it's insufficient resources, maybe it's teacher effort, maybe it's that the curriculum and students' abilities are mismatched. So what we're going to do is to examine these through rigorous impact evaluations. Now, keeping those hypotheses from the last slide in mind, there are a lot of different possible solutions that we could take to improve reading levels. If we think that the school resources are insufficient, maybe we should add more books, or school supplies, or add technology like computers, or hire more teachers. If we think that teacher effort is too low, maybe we should improve teacher training or give teachers incentives based on the performance of their students. If we think that the curriculum isn't matched to the ability of the students, maybe we should rethink the pedagogical approach and try to tailor it a bit more to the level of the students, or provide remedial education to help the children who are behind get up to speed. So first, we're going to look at some interventions that added inputs to classrooms. And by inputs, I mean things like books, school supplies, teaching tools like flip charts, money, all of which are very useful things for schools. And before I start talking about those, it's important just to note that these interventions aren't evaluating the effectiveness of these inputs versus no inputs. Rather, we're looking at the impact of adding additional inputs compared to the status quo of the current classroom. So what this slide shows is that JPAL has done a lot of studies looking at the impacts of adding different kinds of inputs. And once again, this is additional inputs to the classroom, not comparing to no inputs at all. And across all of these studies, there is very little evidence to suggest that adding inputs by themselves is an effective way to increase learning for most students. For example, in Kenya, even though the majority of classrooms only had one textbook for every 20 students, when an organization added textbooks to classrooms, it had no impact on learning for most students. And this was largely because the textbooks themselves were too far above the level of the average student. And most students were unable to even read the textbooks, which were written in English. In Kenya, a similar intervention that provided flip charts as an alternative to textbooks also led to no change in learning outcomes. And in Sierra Leone, providing textbooks didn't work because most of the textbooks stayed locked up in storage and weren't actually made available for use by the students. Perhaps more surprisingly, in India, an intervention that was designed to make books more accessible to children through libraries, so upgrading existing library facilities in schools that already had them, or for schools that didn't have libraries, providing visits from a mobile library, also led to no change in language skills. And most children did use the libraries, but this didn't translate into learning gains. And what these studies are pointing to is the idea that giving students inputs that they're not equipped to use, such as books they can't read, is not going to help them learn. Another type of input that's received a lot of attention as a potentially useful tool for increasing learning is technology, since it seems logical that things like computers would give children access to a whole wide range of resources and actually help them learn how to learn. However, when researchers evaluated 2 programs that provided children with access to computers, one in Peru, one in Colombia, they found that adding computers had no effects other than computer skills. There was no impact on cognitive skills, no impact on language skills. So again, similar to school inputs, it seems that providing children with technology that they don't really know how to use is unlikely to help them learn how to read. Turning to school systems, another thing that we might think about as an input, which is a little less intuitive, is the teachers themselves and the size of the classroom. So if we think smaller classes are better for students, we could add more teachers. And in developed countries, the evidence on smaller classes versus larger classes is rather mixed. But in the context of developing countries, there's little evidence to suggest that simply decreasing class size by itself will increase learning. 2 interventions, one in India, one in Kenya, did exactly that and cut class size in half, and neither had any impact on learning levels. So this suggests that if it's just about class size and teachers aren't changing anything about their pedagogy or taking advantage of the smaller classes to tailor the curriculum more towards students, smaller classes themselves aren't going to change much. Finally, another type of input that we might expect to be useful is giving schools flexible block grants to spend at their own discretion. Since if schools have needs for inputs that aren't being met, this would allow them to be the ones to identify and then alleviate those constraints. But again, surprisingly, these programs didn't increase learning over the long term. In India, giving schools grants to spend on school supplies did increase learning in the first year, but by the second year, the students' households already expected that the school would cover that portion of school supplies, and in turn, they decreased their own spending in response, leading the program's impact to completely disappear by the second year. And in Indonesia and the Gambia, 2 other evaluations of block grant programs found no impact on student learning. So next, I'm going to show you a visual representation of some of these study impacts that I've just discussed. This graph shows the impact of several of those input studies. You'll see that on the y-axis, learning gains are measured in reading levels are measured in standard deviation increases in test scores. This helps us compare results across different contexts and different ways of measuring reading outcomes. But just as a general rule, anything greater than 0.2 standard deviations is considered a large impact. This would be the equivalent of moving the average student from the 50th percentile to the 58th percentile. And like we just discussed, you'll see that most of these studies have a precisely measured 0 effect. But of course, there are 2 exceptions. The first is the school block grant program in India that I just mentioned, but you can see under the bar that by the second year, the impact of the program had disappeared. The second exception is a subgroup of the first textbook study I mentioned in Kenya. Remember how there were 0 learning gains for the majority of students? There's an important caveat to this, which is that for the very highest achieving students, those in the top quintile of the classroom who were at the level of curriculum and could actually read and understand the textbooks in English, having access to a textbook did increase learning. But collectively, the results of these studies indicate that in these contexts, for most students, a pure lack of inputs is not the binding constraint that's preventing them from learning how to read. Now, obviously, some inputs are necessary, and having access to things like books and materials to learn to read off of are an essential part of becoming a strong reader. But if we're adding all these extra resources and seeing no effect, we want to figure out why. So, like John mentioned up front, we think what these studies indicate is that perhaps resources are necessary but not sufficient, and that if these are the only changes we're making to an already poor learning ecosystem, we're not likely to see many changes in learning. So what we want you to take away from these studies is not that inputs are useless by any means, but rather that instead of just adding more resources to the status quo, we can be a lot smarter about the ways we use them in order to help improve children's learning. So what else could we be doing? Well, next, we're going to look at several studies that use inputs to tailor the learning process more towards individual students, or combine inputs with changes in pedagogy. And what these studies indicate is that if inputs are used more smartly, when they're integrated into the learning process, tailored to the student's needs, or used to solve a particular problem or change a teaching approach, they can be very useful tools to increase learning. So this slide shows several studies that, like I just mentioned, indicate that when appropriate inputs are used to solve a particular problem, they can be quite effective. For example, for those high-achieving students in Kenya who were way above their classmates and were able to read textbooks in English, having access to a textbook at their level was a useful tool for them to engage with the curriculum. In the Philippines, a month-long readathon for fourth graders was also an effective way to improve reading skills. This is a program that provided storybooks selected for age appropriateness and appeal, gave teachers training on how to engage students, and the teachers and students did daily activities like storytelling, literacy games, and silent reading. By the end of the month, students had made large increases in learning levels and had read 7 more books than those in a comparison group. And 3 months later, they were still reading more. In the case of technology, researchers have also found that when ICT is used to personalize instruction, it can be a really effective way of increasing learning. So taking a math example, in India, a program of self-paced math games led to large increases in those scores. And taking an example from the post-primary level in secondary schools, where typically there's even larger variation of students' abilities within the classroom, a technology-led instruction program that tailored itself to each student's level and adapted to where they were and allowed them to learn at their own pace led to massive increases in Hindi reading levels. And finally, while we just saw that just providing schools with grants for inputs had little effect, there's some new research coming out of Tanzania suggesting that grants can be made more effective when they're tied to teacher incentives that are linked to their students' performance. So in schools with this grant incentive combo, students made large improvements in reading and math, which suggests that when teachers are motivated to use inputs specifically to increase learning, they know how to use these resources effectively. So taken together, these studies suggest that a lack of inputs is not the binding constraint to learning, but that well-targeted inputs can be very useful tools to increase reading levels. So now I'm going to pass it over to Luke.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John and Megan. I also want to take this opportunity to flag that if you have any questions for us, please send them in. I think we're at about 9:25. I'm probably going to talk for about 15 minutes, so that'll give us 20 minutes to answer questions, have a discussion. So if there's anything you had, any questions you had about JPAL as an organization, any of the studies that Megan talked about, we'd love to have your questions. We'd love to answer them during the last 20 minutes. So I want to stop and talk about the story we've arrived at. And we've seen a number of interventions that have done little to change the business as usual environment in the classroom. And the only thing those interventions did was basically add an additional resource. So as Megan described, you could think of this as holding everything else in the classroom constant and adding something like a book or a computer or a teacher, or a pile of cash for them to decide what resources to spend it on. And we saw that through rigorous evaluation that those weren't very effective at increasing student learning levels. And second, we arrive at a group of interventions that did a little bit more, and they started to combine these resources with another change in the classroom. So think of this as not only adding an additional book or computer, but adding books and shifting the way the classroom is run through either games or a readathon, or better targeting these books or computers so they match the learning levels of the students. And so with these types of interventions, we start to see some increases in learning. And so the slide we're looking at now that I'll switch it over, in contrast with the one that Meagan showed us a couple of slides ago with a whole bunch of zeros. So we have 7 studies here, and 2 of them you already heard about, the readathon in the Philippines and the individually paced computer math games learning in India. And the chart is illustrating a whole different group of interventions that we do see pretty large effects on. And so this is, you can read this the same way as you read the last chart, is that on the x-axis we have individual interventions, each one of them a different type of intervention that's geared towards increasing learning, either in most cases reading outcomes and in some cases math outcomes. And then on the y-axis we have this standard deviation increase in reading levels. Meagan taught us all about how to interpret standard deviations, but these are all sort of at the threshold of something that we think is a pretty effective program at increasing learning. And all of these programs share a common theme of shifting the pedagogy model to be more geared towards where students are in their journey to learn and journey to read. And before we jump into the next slide and sort of go over what we're presenting as the main policy lesson today, and it's useful to stop and think about why we think the first set of programs that Meagan talked to us about didn't work, and why we start to see effects in that second group of program, and then why, with the programs we're about to present, why those are sort of some of the most effective programs we've seen when we're talking about student learning and student reading levels. And for me, it's useful to go back to sort of way back 15 minutes ago when John was talking about reasons why we evaluate programs and how we're looking to identify the binding constraint. You know, what is the thing that's holding students back from learning in these classrooms? And what we've learned, at least through these rigorous evaluations that we're talking about today, is that this real binding constraint in these situations, in these contexts, doesn't just seem to be resources. It doesn't seem to be that, you know, if you just add additional inputs, it'll increase the level of the students, the learning levels of the students. So you might think about providing more tailored materials or more textbooks that are geared towards the learning level of the student, which is why we started to see effects in that top 20% of students in the Kenya study. Or thinking about teachers as an input in the classroom. So rather than just adding more teachers, thinking about how to give the teachers the resources to be able to identify learning levels in the classroom and then tailor the material to their students. And so this all kind of supports the idea that we have sort of classrooms out there that are filled with students with different types of learning levels, and we have a number of different interventions we could do to reorganize the classroom, try to gear the level of the teaching and learning towards the level of the student. And with these types of interventions, we start to see really large effects. And so what we'd like to communicate to you today is sort of that there's a model that's been tested in a number of different settings, in a number of different countries with a number of different variations that has had very large effects on learning, specifically reading scores. And has allowed a lot of students, particularly students at the bottom of the distribution of learning, to catch up to their peers in some circumstances and increase their learning levels. And as you can see on this slide here, this is sort of a very basic overview of what we're talking about. And the idea behind this model is what we call teaching at the right level, which essentially regroups students by ability rather than grade level or age. And as I mentioned, there's a number of different programs that have been very successful using this model. And the basics of it is that you provide teachers or school systems with a tool or outside surveyors that can measure the initial learning level of the student. So it could be sort of a stepwise literacy thing that allows students to, you know, first you ask them if they can read a paragraph, and then if they can't read a paragraph, you ask them if they can read a sentence, and if they can't read a sentence, a word, a letter, and so on. And this sort of gives teachers and students themselves a level where they are in the journey to learn. And then based on the outcomes of those surveys, you would then divide the classrooms by ability level rather than grade level. So it could be, you know, depending how diverse the classroom is, it could be a couple groups geared towards words and sentences, and then one in paragraphs, or it could be 4 groups, you know, if you have people that are young students that are all over the place. So if you have a big group, 6 or 7 students that can identify letters and 6 or 7 students that can identify words, and you would group those in these different groups, and then you would focus their individual instruction on basic skills. So rather than looking to what the curriculum might tell you to teach, you would go and then say, we're gonna do these activities that are geared towards this learning level in this group, and then for the other group do a different set of materials, and sort of have the teacher going around to the different groups and facilitating these activities. And so how did we arrive at this model? And so similar to sort of the ideas that Meagan presented, where you did a randomized evaluation of a number of different programs and sort of started to see a common theme. This sort of same thing happened with these types of interventions. And I think one of the first rigorous evaluations of this type of program brings us back 15 or 17 years ago to one of the first randomized evaluations of education programs that JPEL affiliates ever did, and it was a partnership with Pratham organization, and it was of their Balstocki program, which provided lightly trained and locally hired tutors to sort of pull lower performing students out of the classroom and do a remedial education model. And this led to remarkably large impacts on learning and reading. And then, you know, over the last 15 years, this model has really evolved, and they've tested different types of the different, you know, models in a lot of different settings. So this slide kind of gives you a big overview of all the different types of things that have been tested through randomized evaluations. There have been 5 in India alone of this type of model. Some of them use volunteers, some contract teachers, some government teachers. In some cases, you would run this for an hour in school. In some cases, you might run this for an hour after school. In other cases, they've evaluated a model that's sort of like a summer camp or a month-long intensive burst of this sort of catch-up model to try to, you know, target the students who are really behind in the classroom and then try to catch them up so they're ready when they get back into that classroom. And then through one of the evaluations as well, it's important to point out that this can be, you know, there is a model of it that's been evaluated and very effective with government teachers, but there was also a model that evaluated it with government teachers where they sort of just handed over the materials and some training and found that without sort of additional support in this setting, that it wasn't very effective. So it's something that has evolved over time. That's been they've been testing the model, and different JPEL affiliates have been looking at different ways to modify and tweak and try to increase student learning levels, and sort of we've arrived at some really great models that we've seen some really large effects. And then just so you don't think these are all sort of just Pratham, just India, we want to highlight that these are sort of programs that have been evaluated, or similar sort of thematically similar programs have been evaluated in other contexts and also led to increases in learning and reading levels. A few of those examples are sort of a small group tutoring program in Chile that there was sort of 3 months of college students working with 3rd and 4th graders who were behind and sort of working with them at their level and helping them with reading. And then there's a teacher community assistant program in Ghana, which was essentially a replication or sort of of the Balstocki tutors program that I mentioned. But sort of taking that model, looking at it in a completely different context in Ghana, testing a number of different ways to run it and finding large learning effects there. And sort of a slight variation on that is tracking by initial test scores in Kenya. This is another evaluation that took place many years ago, but that involved this sort of initial assessment part of the teaching at the right level model, and then breaking students up into 2 different classrooms, one at sort of a higher level and one at a lower level, and then they found that sort of having similar peers and then the teachers being able to sort of target their teaching to that level was found to be effective. And then just to throw a different example from the US in there and focus on math, there's this very interesting program of match tutoring in Chicago. It's a bit more intensive, sort of like a 2-on-1 model with sort of the ratios of who's working with who. But this was also sort of a similar type of theory of change of trying to meet students at their level and target the level of instruction to where they are. And these were all had positive effects on reading and in the Chicago tutoring program math. And so this sort of brings us to today, that this model has evolved over the past 10 or 15 years. It's been tested in a number of different settings. We've tried to find, what's working well, what level of training do we need for teachers or outside monitoring help, what are the different ways to split the classroom, where do we do it in school or out of school, and with which type of teacher. And it sort of allowed us to arrive at two models that we think are really sort of good candidates for scaling up, and something that's really been tested, as I mentioned, in a number of different settings. So we have sort of 10 or so very rigorous evaluations, all pointing in the same direction, all positively for these learning models. And so those two models are based on one, the sort of teacher-led model with government teachers of sort of, allowing the government teachers to have an hour within school to apart from their normal curriculum, to target their instruction in this group model. So you might have, you do your normal classroom setting, and then you break the students up for an hour and do these activities to help them catch up. And then there's also this learning camps model, which is sort of short bursts of 10 or 20 days of camp, so to really try to allow students to catch up. And then as a final point, I think we're advocating for this scale, these models of things that are good candidates for scale up. We have a few examples of this really turning in practice. So this last bullet here, looking at contextualizing and scaling up. Our JPAL South Asia office right now is partnering with a number of state governments in India to scale up these models and really monitor and evaluate how this could work at a large scale and in different Indian states. And so they're working with several of these state governments, and it's reaching a number of students. And we have a lot more information on that, and we're happy to have a discussion at the end. And then Ghana, this was sort of the program I talked about before of trying to take this model and look at it somewhere completely different. They did the replication of the Balsaki program. And then in Zambia right now, we have this program where we're working with the Ministry of Education in Zambia, and they're doing this sort of learning journey where they're partnering up and going to visit the programs in India to see how the model's working there. There's some staff or JPAL staff from South Asia and Pratham staff who've come to Zambia to sort of provide some technical expertise on how this might work in the Zambia context, where similarly they have classrooms with students where they're all over the learning distribution. And so in the next year they're doing a pilot in about, I think it's 80 to 120 schools of this catch-up remedial education program to try to figure out how this model would work in the Zambian context. And then sort of based on those learnings, potentially scaling it up to more schools if it's successful in the next year. So normally I would ask, if I could see you in the audience, I would ask you to summarize the policy lessons to see if I did a good job or not. So I'll let sort of dwell on these, but I think the main points we want you to take away with today, or have all of you sort of have learned today from our presentation, is that, through this idea of rigorously testing education models, we've sort of arrived at different policy lessons that we think are useful for policymakers and people making and implementing organizations who are sort of working on these programs and trying to figure out what are effective programs to increase student learning. And sort of the lessons that we saw today is through 8 or 10 evaluations of just adding resources. Those weren't very effective at increasing student learning levels, perhaps because books were locked in the closet, perhaps because the textbooks weren't well geared for the learning levels of the students, or perhaps because those resources weren't really targeting the binding constraint on learning. But we do start to see, when you start to use these inputs in a smarter way and tailor them to the level of the students, or engage students through a readathon, or do something a little bit different with a little tweak in the classroom or a tweak in the pedagogy model, we start to see big effects on student learning. And so these changes in pedagogy are really key. And then going from there, we've evaluated a number of these: remedial education, teaching at the right level, catch up. There's a number of different ways we could label it, but we've evaluated a lot of these types of programs that have very similar theories of change, and these are very consistently effective at increasing student learning levels. And so I think that brings us, but before we take questions, I just wanted to call out some of the resources. So if you're very excited by what you've heard today, and you're completely sold on the idea of evidence-based or evidence-informed policymaking and programmatic decision-making, we have a lot of resources that I and Megan and John have worked very hard on, and our co-chairs, Rachel and Karthik, and other people on the JPAL staff, to try to make sort of accessible to anyone that is interested in these ideas of what works and what doesn't when it comes to increasing student learning. And just to call out a few that we think are really great. The first one is this, it's a cost effectiveness analysis. I believe this is a link to our website that looks at different policy lessons on improving test scores and the cost effectiveness of those, so that, you know, not only, like Megan and I showed you with the two charts, just looks at effectiveness of saying, okay, we're going to look at a bunch of different programs and say, was this effective or not? It takes it a step further and only looks at the programs that were effective and then adds costs into the factor to say, okay, if these 10 programs were effective, which were most cost effective based on a, you know, learning impact per dollar type of measure. And then the second thing to call out is this policy briefcases that we write. And this one specifically is on the Philippines Readathon program. It's called Booked for Learning. And so what these are 2 to 4 page policy summaries that everyone on the JPAL policy group writes all the time. And these are to try to make, you know, that academic paper that gets produced after one of these evaluations a bit more accessible. And we try to put different charts in there and ways to illustrate what were the main learnings coming out of each study. And so for these brief cases, they focus on one study that we think is really important or has a really exciting policy lesson. And then for the next bullet, we have bulletins as well, which, you know, don't just look at one study, but we try to summarize the lessons from a number of studies. So that's sort of a written form of what we've done today a little bit, is try to sort of walk through a number of different studies and try to summarize what are the key lessons coming out of those. And then finally, these are sort of, if you're very interested in what you learned today, there's sort of 2 education impact evaluation toolkits that are out there. The first one is really just a great overview of just about every randomized evaluation and rigorous study that's been done on education in the past 10 or so years. It was done by Paul Glevy, a JPAL affiliate, and Karthik Mullaridharan, our JPAL education sector co-chair, and that summarizes lessons from about 120 studies. Up front, there's they do some economic modeling of the sorts, but then at about chapter 3 or 4, they jump in and they start to summarize all of the different studies and buckets into different theories of change and lessons. And it's really a useful tool to say you're interested in one particular type of program, maybe it's technology or these teaching at the right level things. They kind of have a page or 2 on each one of those types of interventions, and they summarize the evidence for each one of those groups. And then if you're a practitioner and you're looking to do your own randomized evaluations of these types of programs, there's also this sort of field experiments in education in developing countries toolkit that's available on our website. And that's a little bit sort of looks at what are the key research issues out there, what are the key questions, how do you design one of these rigorous studies, you know, what questions have we already answered out there with RCTs, and what questions are still open. And so it's a really sort of these very in-depth toolkit if that's something you're looking for. And if you have any questions about these resources, please feel free to reach out to any of this. I think we have Megan's email on there, so you could use her as a first point of contact. But all of us are more than happy to be in touch and try to answer any questions any of you have about anything we've said today. So I think that brings us, I think I'm about 5 minutes over what I said, but we still have around 15 minutes. I hope you're all still there and have questions for us or we're happy to stick around for as long as all of you would like to stick around and ask us questions. But Kim, I don't know if you've already gotten some questions or if you wanted to.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions.
All right, great.
We have a large audience attending today, so there have been quite a few questions.
Yeah, thank you all very much for coming on a Friday morning.
Yes, in the middle of August at that. I want to add, a few questions have come in. The PowerPoint that they've shared today there's a link in the reminder email that was sent out on Wednesday. If you do not have that, please let us know. They've been wonderful in sharing their materials, so we can pass them on to you. So I think in terms of the questions, let's go from the ones that were sent first. Judith Baker asked, you mentioned that books sometimes are in English. How does the local language factor in? That was particularly one of the issues in textbook inputs that were provided in English and not in the language of instruction for students, or I guess their mother tongue.
So as the first point to jump in, I just want to bring it back to that issue of fines and constraints. And, in that intervention, the textbooks were in English, and so, there was an issue with targeting in that most of the kids weren't able to read in English. But I think we might see similar results if, in general, if kids can't read in their own language, providing textbooks that's at the level of curriculum but not where they are is going to be just about as ineffective as giving textbooks in English that they can't read.
And I think off the top of my head, I don't have the study in mind. I know there have been RCTs of evaluations that look at sort of mother tongue and these different types of, comparing, the language of instruction versus potentially the second or the third or the fourth language that these students are speaking. I can speak to, we can look that up and try to provide that as a resource later. I think with the important thing for the types of interventions at the end that we were talking about with these sort of teaching at the right level is that all of these materials are locally adapted. They are sort of geared towards that local context. I think especially with the models that Pratham is running that have been evaluated there, they have their materials in something like 20 or 25 different languages and try to use them sort of in the local context there to be able to teach at that level where, maybe in the language that they're speaking at home or that they would be reading in their local community.
Great. I think that addresses a number of questions related to language. Particularly for early grade reading, that is a significant issue that we address. Students cannot learn to read when they are learning in a language in which they do not speak.
Yeah.
So, I think that's where a lot of that interest and concern is coming from in the questions. Another question, does JPAL or others have a guide on how to effectively evaluate education programs, whether it's RCT or an alternative?
We have a lot of resources on how to evaluate, if that's what you're interested in. So I think, as John mentioned at the beginning, we have a training team that sort of focuses exclusively on these issues. We have a number of sort of courses, online materials, a whole research resources section of our website devoted to, why evaluate, why randomize, look at all the different types of impact evaluation and the strengths and weaknesses of each, or the assumptions that you have to pull in for each type of that evaluation. And then I think we're still on the slide actually for this field experiments in education in developing countries. I think if you're very interested in education impact evaluations, that would be a good place to start as well. I think, the research resources, or we have an edX course that goes through our whole executive education as well, on all the different evaluation methods. But I don't know if I'm forgetting any other.
No, I think that's right. I think a great place to start is if you go onto edX, there's a course called JPAL 101X. It's not specific to education, but it's a great primer. And then a second resource is Rachel Glenister has a book, who's our executive director, called Running Randomized Evaluations. I think that, coupled with this more technical field experiments in education in developing countries that Meagan and Luke referred to, are some good materials to get started with.
Yeah, there's also a website that goes with Running Randomized Evaluations by Rachel. So I think I think it just might be runningres.com. I might be wrong, but I think that's it. And they have sort of chapter by chapter toolkits and blog posts that look at all different types of issues within impact evaluation.
Great, thank you. Questions, albeit in different ways, have touched on the issues of ability grouping, the potential stigma attached to that, follow-up on studies that have there been follow-up to measure participants' persistence and success? Can you all speak a bit more to potentially any long-term studies that you have on the impact of ability grouping?
No, that's good. It's fantastic. I mean, this comes up a lot. And so one of the things in terms of the stigma of ability grouping is that in most of these courses, most of these programs that we've evaluated, they've been supplementary, and so they're not kind of tracked for the entire day or the entire school year into their ability grouping. And then the second is a key component, particularly of Pratham's work in India, which I'm most familiar with. I was based there for the last 4 years, is that there is reoccurring assessment that's done every couple of months. So when kids are able to go beyond recognizing letters, they get moved into the sentence group and then from sentence to word. I think a really good question is the long-term effects. So one of the studies that it was done in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, which is 200 million people, was looking at the effect of a 50-day supplementary remedial education program, which took place pretty much for the 2/3 of the school day. And that had really big gains, like 0.7 standard deviations, which are just huge gains. And so that is something that we are now just completed a second end line, which I believe 2 to 3 years later goes back and tracks the kids who got the program and the kids who don't, who did not, to compare the differences. So those results should be forthcoming, but this is a huge issue in that a lot of education programs, the evidence we've shared so far, is tracking the gains right after the program is completed. And I think then that's the key question. You can imagine a world where a kid learns how to do basic math and read in her local language and is able to build on that through reading materials that are at home, or catch up to the curriculum a little bit in school, as Luke referred to. You can also imagine for some kids that they close the gap but remain far behind. There's not reading material in the house. The teachers don't put out a lot of effort, and you lose those gains. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of work that's been done in this, but we're very cognizant of it and trying to move in that direction.
Great, thank you. It seems like we have time for one more question. Please, I would like the three of you to also check out the other questions that our attendees have asked, and those whose question we are not going to have time to get to, please do reach out to Meagan Neal. Her email, as you'll see, is on the last slide, and I just shared a link to the PowerPoint in the chat window. So you'll have access to all of this information. I think one question we really need to get to, because I think it's under-researched, is how all of this fits into education in emergency settings. So Emily Tuzlime has asked, how relevant are these interventions to teaching literacy in education emergencies where all resources are scarce?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I think we get a lot as well. I think they're for obvious reasons, because I think with emergency situations or situations where people are displaced or sort of out of school, or it is a time where especially students can fall behind or find themselves in a setting where there are really diverse backgrounds of students and learning levels. To my knowledge, from our sort of the literature standpoint or from the rigorous evaluation standpoint, there haven't been sort of evaluations of these types of programs in those contexts. I think what we would say is that, that it seems like this could be, this type of model could be a good this is the type of model that could work in those settings, I think, because it is sort of, obviously the main point that was brought up in the question is that resources are scarce, and that some of these programs do need resources. I think in some cases they are sort of, they're not too resource intensive. They do, there are, with some of the programs, it is sort of just providing some very basic materials that are sort of geared towards the learning level. But that is but I think, there are different ways, especially maybe thinking about like the short intensive summer campy or like intensive bursts of education, or sort of, one intervention we didn't
mentioned today, but there was an evaluation of a speed schools program in Mali that kind of had a similar theory of change, similar model of sort of trying to catch students up who had been out of school for a long time. It was specifically geared towards students who had been out of school for a long time, and sort of do this sort of intensive short burst of learning, and that was also evaluated and found to be very effective at increasing learning outcomes. But I think that is sort of a really good point and something to think about, and sort of those challenges of whether it's a low resource setting or I don't know, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we're going to have to go ahead and wrap up there. As I mentioned, there are many questions in the chat window. People are very interested in the work that the education team is doing in JPAL. Hopefully we can reconvene sometime again in the future, because there is just so much interest in what you all are doing. I just want to say thank you to our three presenters, John, Meagan, and Luke, for what has truly been a dynamic and thought-provoking hour. I want to thank our attendees for your attention, for your fantastic questions. My apologies to those we could not get to. Again, please feel free to reach out to Meagan. So again, I want to say thank you to everyone, and I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you all so much for coming and for all your questions.
Have a great Friday.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.